Well, if you are a reader, you know how hard it can be to put a good book down. Just one more chapter. One more chapter. Perhaps that's not the impulse you find it hard to resist. Perhaps for you it's the chocolate that's in your cupboard. Or the cookies that call to you so that instead of just one or three, you eat the whole package. It is the comfort maybe of your pillow in the morning that makes you want to roll over for just 5 more minutes. Hit the snooze button again and again and again instead of getting up and going for a walk or going to the gym. Maybe it's the appeal of the credit card that allows you to engage in what is sometimes called retail therapy. Or in these days of streaming services, you might intend to watch just a single episode of something, but you know how at the end it just kind of rolls into the next one and rolls into the next one, and then you suddenly realize you have binge-watched an entire season or series in one sitting. These are some of the ways we might relate to the struggle for self-control. As we were noting earlier, the Lay's potato chip company has long used the concept of temptation or a lack of self-control in its advertising campaigns. So much so that while the campaign used to be, it's impossible to eat just one chip, the current thinking assumes that, of course, you're going to eat more than one chip. And so the tagline is now, bet you can't pick just one, because it refers to the temptation to have multiple bags with multiple flavors, you see. You can't just have one bag, you have to have many of the various kinds. So much so that they engaged just recently, hockey player Mark Messier, who has long been one of their spokespeople, in a closed social experiment. And they called it casting call. And so people were invited into a setting where they were told they were going to be auditioning for a part. And there were bags of Lay's chips placed strategically around the waiting room. And the plan was to award a great deal of money to anyone in the waiting room who only chose one flavor. Instead, in each private audition, as they called people into the room, they found themselves filming people's reactions to being told they had lost out on the money because they had eaten more than one kind of chip. Now, it's an edited piece, right? So we see the disappointed and stunned candidates. We don't see anyone who lost complete control of their emotions when they're told, oh, you could have won $1 million, but you ate 2 kinds of chips. But that is also one of the ways that some of us might relate to the struggle for self-control, isn't it? In fact, it's probably the place where self-control might bring the most damaging or specific consequences of all. Controlling what we say and how we say it. Have you ever lashed out in anger or fear or hurt? Have you ever found things coming out of your mouth the moment you think or feel them, regardless of how they might make someone else feel, and then later think, why did I say that? Pretty much every comment section online these days is full of people reacting without thinking, just saying or typing the first thing that pops into their head without a filter of any kind. The Apostle Paul understood this struggle regarding impulse control. In Romans 7, I love what we hear him read him saying, because he says, why is it that I do the very thing that I've sworn not to do? Indeed, if you take a look through the Bible and you're thinking with the lens of self-control, what you find time after time after time after time after time is people failing to control their impulses. That's what's happening most of the time in the Bible. And even Jesus felt this struggle, didn't he? That's what we witness in today's scripture reading. Jesus is in the wilderness, and we hear him facing a series of temptations regarding self-control. Just turn these stones into bread. You're hungry. It begins with his version of fast food, really. I expect that some of you do know the temptation of, just going through a drive-through instead of figuring out what to make out of the ingredients that are in your fridge or in your cupboard, especially if it's getting late and you don't have a plan. But, as is the case with almost all our impulses, for Jesus, there is an underlying issue that causes this temptation to choose unhealthy coping mechanisms for ourselves. For Jesus, his hunger is way deeper than that. And bread might solve his immediate pangs, but it's not going to deal with his insecurity that what if he doesn't have enough bread for everyone? Or maybe what he has to offer the world isn't going to be enough, isn't going to be acceptable, isn't going to do what God wants it to do. The second temptation Jesus receives is an opportunity for control, external control. So often we, I think, struggle with our self-control and our own discipline when we feel like we don't have control over very much else in our lives. So then we struggle with trying to figure out how to control ourselves. And his third temptation is to take the easy route to popularity by doing something that's going to make him famous and give him celebrity credibility and a legion of fans. But you see, followers who are fans are always looking for a show. They always want something from you, and they aren't really interested in changing hearts and lives. It's a short-term kind of thing. And that's the truth. In the wilderness, the temptations are all about quick fixes, immediate gratification, where the negative consequence won't be felt for an unknown time down the road. You might not see it, but there eventually will be consequences. And this, I think, is true for most of us. When we wrestle with the issues around self-control or discipline or whatever we want to call that it seems easier to go with the instant gratification and deal with the consequences later. If I don't floss my teeth today, it won't really make a difference tomorrow. If I skip my exercise routine or don't get a good sleep one night, I can make it up another time. And knowing that there are negative consequences to these kind of behaviors doesn't really make changing it very simple, does it? Quite the opposite. Ask anyone who has struggled with any form of addiction. It's not simply a matter of willpower, like the kind that Paul is wishing for in Romans. If anybody would have willpower, you'd think it would be Paul. And there he is. Why am I doing that thing that I say I'm not going to do? That thing that we might call going cold turkey is just very difficult. You can't just say, I'm not going to do it. I'm done. That's good. Well, there are a few vices that you can try that with, and some people, surprisingly, do have success with that. Some people can quit smoking that way, but most experts will say it's not going to get you the best results. It's not going to get you long-term results. Humans just aren't wired that way. And then, even if you're tempted to go that way, most of the time when we want to exercise self-control, it's not something that we can go cold turkey with, relying on some sort of willpower that will just stop things. We can't live at the radical limits of most things. So, for example, if emotional eating is your thing, well, that's fine, but you can't simply stop eating all food. You can't stop spending money entirely if spending is your struggle. You cannot, by sheer determination, stop feeling, and therefore stop from saying inappropriate or hurtful things. It just doesn't work that way. And particularly, simply trying to repress our feelings or anger or pretend you don't have them might work for a short time, but it won't make it go away. And those things that you feel will come out some way, somehow. And if you've repressed them, probably at the most inappropriate times and in the worst possible places. And self-control is not about simply keeping quiet, is it? Jesus doesn't. But it's rather being able to choose what you say instead of reacting and just letting it go. So, it's hard. It's impossible. So what can we do? For Jesus, the purpose of his time in the wilderness was trying to bring awareness to the issues he would be facing. Today we'd say, until we admit we have a problem. Isn't that the first step for those dealing with substance abuse issues, for example? One step is being honest about our behavior, our temptations, and the future consequences. That's what Jesus was doing in the wilderness. One step is rooting ourselves in the values that matter to us, to remind ourselves over and over again of our priorities so that we can act with those priorities in mind instead of the thing that we are thinking of in the moment. If we want to have healthy teeth and gums, that's the value. Then we have to remind ourselves we want to have healthy teeth so that we can take that 5 minutes every day to pick up the toothbrush. That's what Jesus was doing in the wilderness, reminding himself of what mattered, reminding himself of what he cared about. Or reminding ourselves of how much we value and care for other people can help us to resist the urge to say that thing we feel the moment that we feel it. And just to take that moment or two before we react, to take that deeper breath before we speak, to take a moment, to count to 10, whatever we need to do to pause. We chose raisins as our fruit of the week because people often use raisins to practice building awareness around eating or anything else we might do without thinking. It helps us figure out the process of taking time, doing things mindfully. Because isn't that kind of what a lack of self-control amounts to? Doing things without consideration. And so anytime we interrupt our unthinking patterns with awareness, there is an opportunity for us to make a different choice. It doesn't mean we will take it, but there are opportunities for different behavior. And there are some ways that we can choose to make these choices easier on ourselves. Psychologists tell us that part of our mindfulness can be to stop placing ourselves in situations where we must keep making these kinds of choices. So, for example, if you don't have the box of Timbits on the counter, you're less likely to eat them. If the gym clothes are washed and ready to wear, you're more likely to get out the door than if they're still in the laundry. If we are well rested, we are less likely to be emotionally triggered by something that doesn't go our way or something that someone else says. Getting enough sleep can help us take a moment rather than lashing out at someone in anger, right? And perhaps more important still, we need to be willing to embrace forgiveness of others and ourselves, because self-control is a complicated business, and none of us find that balance easily. So giving ourselves and others grace for unexpected outbursts or impolite behavior can help us be genuinely curious about what is behind those behaviors instead of immediately judging them. which opens up another pathway to support change if we want it. In fact, being vulnerable enough to ask for help is one of the best ways for us to develop self-control. Telling someone your plans allows them to support you in your plans, doesn't it? If you tell someone why you have to reduce your salt or your sugar intake, they might actually stop offering you the pretzels or the cake. Explaining to someone why you get so upset about a particular issue might help both of you to have better conversations about emotional topics. Even just sharing your intentions with someone. Here's something I really want to do, I really want to try, opens up the possibility that they might ask you about it, which will invite you to be more mindful rather than careless in the way you speak or act. When we consider Jesus' story, we might be tempted, see what I did there, to assume that the point of the story is that Jesus was the superhero of self-control. But I don't think that's what the story shows us at all. What I notice in this story about Jesus is that Jesus does not rely on his own strength alone. He calls upon the wisdom and support of his faith ancestors and his religious tradition. With every response he gives his tempter, he's quoting the wisdom of his faith tradition. He's relying on the wisdom of people who've traveled this path before. He quotes the Bible. He trusts that he is supported by his Creator and a communion of saints. I also notice in the story, it's right there at the end, with a promise. It ends with a promise that the tempter will return at an opportune time. This is not a story where Jesus graduates with a gold star, comes out of the wilderness, and he's good to go. It is a preview in private of temptations that from now on will show up in public. And they'll show up not just once, but again and again and again. What I see in this story is Jesus demonstrating the value of taking private time to mindfully attend to what matters to us, so that when those temptations keep coming at us when we are busy and trying to do all sorts of things, he can remind himself what matters to him. We can remind ourselves what matters to us. And if you follow his example, will you put the book down every time? Probably not. Will you still make choices that you don't intend? Absolutely. But maybe less often. And maybe with a greater portion of humility, a greater willingness to engage in grace and forgiveness. And I dare say then, an increased sense of self-control. For the gifts of the Spirit are not a one-way street. You don't just create them all by yourself. They come as gifts as much as they are cultivated. So with God's help, as we stay rooted in our values, we might experience their power. It is a journey. So is life. So is Lent. May our reflections and our actions result in fruitful living. Amen.